Hello everyone. My name is Anne-Marie Dion. I am a professor at the University of Ottawa, Ottawa, Canada. The research I am about to present is about ideologies in multicultural children's literature. This research was conducted from a sample of French-Canadian picture books that were published from 2003 and 2012. This is the overview of the presentation. First, the context of the research, which will bring us to the research questions, followed by a short explanation of the theoretical framework, the methodology, the results, and at last, the discussion and conclusion that are emerging from the results. To explain the context of the research, I begin with a few facts about Canada. In Canada, the population is about 35 million. Since the 1980s, there have been important demographic changes due in part by the importance of immigration. That brings us to talk about visible minorities. In Canada, visible minorities are persons other than Aboriginal people who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. In 2010, 20% of the Canadians were part of a visible minority. It is predicted that in 2031, one-third of Canadians will be part of visible minorities. As for official languages, there is French and English. 22% of the Canadian population is Francophone. It is important to note that many newcomers are joining the French communities to live their lives. The Canadian ideology about multiculturalism is the cultural mosaic. The mosaic metaphor is based on the belief that Canada becomes a stronger country by having immigrants bring with them their cultural diversity for all Canadians to learn from. This ideology is a guiding light for many Canadian institutions, and it can certainly have an effect on all cultural domains, such as children's literature. But, despite demographic changes that have been taking place since the 1980s, we don't know much what is going on in regard to multiculturalism and children's literature. For example, we don't know about the availability of French-Canadian multicultural picture books. But what do we mean by multicultural picture books? And why are they so important to us? As we can see, multicultural children's literature are books about specific cultural groups considered to be outside of the dominant social political culture. So it could be books about race, ethnicity, religions, handicap, age, gender, sexual orientation, or other characteristics. But in the present study, we will refer more specifically to picture books in which there are representation of peoples who are visible minorities, which mean non-Caucasian in race and non-white in color. Those picture books can be the work of authors and illustrators who are themselves part of a visible minority or part of the mainstream culture. In Canada, Asian, Black, Hispanic, and Arab are considered as visible minority people. Multicultural children's books have many benefits. First, they promote a sense of belonging among minority children. In fact, it has been shown to bolster their self-esteem and their cultural identity. Second, they promote success of minority children in learning to read. More specifically, their reading motivation, their comprehension, and even basic abilities such as phonological awareness and reading fluidity. Now, for all students, multicultural children's picture book fosters acceptance of individual differences. In fact, picture books can have a marking influence of the developing mind of children in regard to their attitudes and stereotypes towards others. At last, it increases children's knowledge about the world. They can be a good source of knowledge about the society and the ways people live their life. Given the importance of multicultural children's literature, let's see what previous research has to say on the subject. Here are a few research that were conducted in the United States. In short, they sustain that in the United States, there are relatively few picture books representing visible minorities. There are even fewer picture books written or illustrated by visible minorities authors and illustrators. Also, when members of visible minorities are represented in picture books, it is often in a monolithic fashion or lack of authenticity. Stereotypes regarding visible minorities are still persistent in many recent children's picture books. And some picture books are conveying an assimilationist ideology, while others are conveying a pluralist ideology in regards to multiculturalism. As for research that were done in Canada, to our knowledge, not a single one has considered the picture book. We can see that in the 1980s, in novels for intermediate or adolescent readers, there were more and more multicultural representations, but they were not in the leading roles. However, in the following decades, protagonists from multiple racial or ethnic backgrounds were often found in leading roles in novels. At last, in another study, it was shown that positive images of immigrants are conveyed in novels written by migrant authors. However, we don't know much about multicultural picture books, so that brings us to our questions of the present research. This research is twofold. First, we wanted to quantitatively evaluate the importance of the representation of peoples from visible minorities in French-Canadian picture books. Second, from a qualitative point of view, we were also wondering if the cultural mosaic of Canada appears throughout the picture books that are available. More specifically, this study aims to answer the following questions. What percentage of picture books published by French-Canadian editors from 2003 to 2012 feature people from visible minorities? What groups are represented and to what extent? Our second question, what is the racial or ethnic background of the authors and illustrators of these picture books? And at last, in picture books in which there are members of visible minorities, what are the ideologies that are conveyed regarding multiculturalism? Two different theoretical frameworks were used to analyze our books. First, the Bishop typology. It is a classification of the multicultural books into three categories. First, the socially conscious book. They are written by white authors to help white children understand the experiences of non-white people. Since they are written from an outsider perspective, they may lack of authenticity, and they may also present or maintain certain cultural stereotypes. Second, the melting pot books. Those books are presenting white and non-white people together, but without differentiating among them. Such books do not take into account the cultural differences among people from different cultural backgrounds. Other than the skin color, it is as if everybody would be similar. In fact, without looking at the illustration in the picture books, you cannot tell if the story you are listening to is about non-white fellows. Third, the culturally conscious book. Those books are reflecting the experiences of the minority groups from an insider perspective. They are mostly written by authors that are themselves part of the minority. Otherwise, they are based on adequate research or source of information. They are exempt of any stereotypes, and the authenticity is an important aspect that reveals itself throughout the storyline and the detail of the illustration. To refine our analysis, two approaches of multicultural education from a model developed by Grant and Slater was particularly relevant to this study. The assimilation approach can be observed in picture books that promote assimilation of the minority. For example, it could be the valorization of conformity to the dominant norm, sustaining that immigrants would succeed in the Western world only if they conform to those cultural norms. Assimilation can also be observed in picture books when manifestations of cultural diversity are dissuaded, for example, changing the way minority people would verbally express themselves, or disapproving the way they would dress, etc. As opposed to assimilation approach, the cultural pluralism approach can be observed in picture books that are encouraging manifestation of cultural diversity. To answer our questions of research, we conduct some content analysis. The first part was basically a quantitative analysis in order to find some French-Canadian multicultural picture book to be analyzed. From a quarterly journal dedicated to French-Canadian children's literature, we retrieve a list of most of the picture books published by French-Canadian editors from 2003 to 2012. We found over 1,000 books. The unit of analysis was the individual picture book. For each book, we coded the bibliographic information, the nature of the characters, the racial and ethnic background of all characters, as well as racial and ethnic background of the authors and illustrators. Each book was analyzed by 3 intercoders, 2 assistants and myself, and the percentage of agreement were between 88 and 100%. As for the second part of the study, we took only the picture books in which we found representation of visible minorities. That was the qualitative analysis. Those picture books were scrutinized in order to find elements of ideologies, first as defined by Grant and Slater, and after that as defined by Bishop. The analysis of each picture book were conducted independently by the 3 same intercoders, and divergence of opinion were resolved by discussion. We can now see the results of our study. First, the qualitative. I will begin by presenting the quantitative data of the study. First, the distribution of picture books in regard to racial or ethnic background of characters. There were 794 picture books in which we found human characters. Only those books were considered. As we can see, the visible minorities are not well represented in the picture books that we analyzed. In fact, we found only 43 books representing members of visible minorities. And, as you can see, even in picture books in which there are some representation of visible minorities, they are not always represented independently of white people. In order to take into account the works of most authors and illustrators involved in the production of French-Canadian picture books, we calculated the percentage for all the books that were published from 2003 and 2012. So, this is the distribution of picture books among racial and ethnic background of authors and illustrators. We can see that only 16 picture books were written by authors who are part of minorities, and 30 picture books were illustrated by a representative of a minority. If we consider the 43 multicultural picture book, you cannot see that information on that table, but only 4 were written by authors who are from a visible minority, and only 7 were illustrated by an illustrator from a visible minority. Now, here are the results of our analysis regarding ideologies. First, we will see the classification using Grant and Slater's model. After that, we will see how this classification interact with Bishop's typology. According to Grant and Slater's model, 21 of our 43 multicultural picture books promote an ideology of cultural pluralism. In general, those books are containing passages in the text or details in the illustrations that are promoting cultural diversity. Many cultural manifestations are evident in each of these picture books. An example of that would be the names or the surnames that are used to designate people. Another example would be the fact that members of a particular group are not presented in a monolithic fashion, who are eating the same thing or are all dressed the same way. In the illustrations, we can clearly observe some variation in the skin colors of black people. In regards to Bishop's typology, 4 of those picture books are to be classified as being cultural conscious books. 3 of those are written by authors that are themselves part of the visible minorities that are presented. The 4th one is written by a white author who had first-hand experience with the minority group presented, which brings some authenticity to her work. All the other picture books would be classified as social conscious books. They are written by white authors to help white children understand the experiences of non-white people. Because they are written from an outsider perspective, they may lack authenticity and they may convey cultural stereotypes. And we are glad to say that any of those picture books were found to be melting pot books. According to Grant and Slater's model, 14 of our multicultural picture books were found to sustain neither the cultural pluralism or the assimilation ideologies. We call them picture books that are neutral, since their characteristics were not corresponding to any of the educational approaches suggested by Grant and Slater. However, when we analyze those picture books in light of Bishop's typology, 5 of them have to be considered as melting pot books. Even if they are representation of visible minorities in those picture books, the cultural differences are not taken into account. It seems that visible minorities are included in those picture books only to be politically correct. Other than the skin color, it is as if everybody are sharing exactly the same cultural background, which, of course, is the one of the majority. All of the other picture books could be considered as being social conscious books since they are written by white authors. And none of those picture books are to be considered as cultural conscious books. In regards to Grant and Slater's model, as much as 8 of our multicultural picture books are conveying aspects of an assimilationist ideology. They clearly promote the assimilation of the minorities. For example, in one of those books, Aixa, a young girl from Haiti, arrived in Canada. In school, other students make fun of her accent and the color of her skin. In order to help Aixa adapt to her new country, the teacher summoned that she has to pronounce clearly the sound R at the end of the words. So, bonjour in Creole would become bonjour in French. So Aixa get to practice. Her assimilation is evident by the following phrase when she says 7 jours plus tard, c'est fini. On ne rit plus de mes R. Je les prononce tous. That means 7 days later, everything is all right. People don't laugh at my R anymore since I pronounce them all. In each of those 8 picture books, other examples such as this one could be given. When taking into account Bishop's typology, 3 books are found to be melting pot picture books, which means that white and non-white are depicted as being exactly the same, except for the color of their skin. Without looking at the illustration of those picture books, you wouldn't be able to tell if the story you are listening to is about members of visible minorities. In line with our first question of research, we can say that in French-Canadian population, minorities' children don't have much chance to come across many French-Canadian picture books in which their cultural origins are celebrated. In fact, in Canada, people that are part of visible minority are now presenting 20% of the population. But since only about 5% of the French picture books are showing people from visible minorities, it can be said that there are an important gap between Canada's demographic reality and the representativeness of diversity in the French-Canadian picture books. A possible consequence of that? Just as attitudes and stereotypes begin to take form in the developing minds of young children, they receive the message that the stories of certain racial or ethnic groups may not be interesting enough to be written. To answer our second question of research, in Canada, there is a shortage of authors and illustrators of picture books that are themselves part of minority. So, to us, it seems sensible to encourage editors to publish more works from multicultural authors and illustrators. A consequence of that shortage is that in Canada, most multicultural picture books are produced by mainstream creators from an outsider perspective. They may have a tendency to present the visible minorities in a monolithic fashion, and their work may lack cultural authenticity. Nevertheless, mainstream authors and illustrators who are conscious about authentic representation of multiculturalism are also able to produce high-quality multicultural picture books, as long as their work is grounded in well-documented research. And finally, what we can say about the ideologies. Some French multicultural picture books that are published in Canada are conveying an ideology of cultural pluralism, which is well aligned with the ideology of the cultural mosaic that is so dear to most Canadians. However, some picture books that are sustaining an assimilationist ideology can also be found, as well as picture books in which cultural stereotypes are evident. A possible consequence of that? Taking into account the effects that picture books can have on the developing minds of young children, it is imperative to teach them to recognize and to question ideologies that can be presented to them in those picture books. I thank you very much for your attention, and for any questions or comments regarding this presentation, please do not hesitate to contact me. Goodbye.